quick summary. Because we're almost fucking finished. In the beginning, life was created. And this has largely been considered a bad move and made a lot of people very angry. And then there was revolution on Mars. This also made a lot of people very angry, and nobody could really agree what it was all about. And now we're living in the bombed hellscape of Mars. There weren't actual bombs, so it was more like kinetic bombs, you know? They just set the atmosphere on fire. It wasn't like an atomic chain reaction or anything. And now we are fully entering the hidden colony, which is a colony that like hitchhiked and then underground railroaded itself into some sort of actual society. But I don't really know much about it, and neither do you. Shikata Ganai. And where we left off last week, our brave heroes were riding on their way to the hidden colony after ducking surveillance and assassinations and reconnaissance teams. They fully made it under cover of dark, halfway there. And then, all of a sudden, there was a massive biblical flood. I don't even know how to describe it to you. Just imagine there was a biblical flood. And it came rushing down the canyon that they were traveling on. And luckily, through random chance, they were saved from it because they were high enough up on a ledge. And then the ledge collapsed and it got eroded, and then like water came in. But then luckily the water like the water kept freezing and like damming up. But then the water would overcome the dam because it was so much water and it was so high pressure, because like you literally don't understand how massive the aquifer is. So then the aquifer is so massive and it's being channeled through at such high pressure that it would actually overcome the rock and ice dams. And then luckily our heroes were not drowned / crushed. And that is where we left off last week. This is what it was like when my basement flooded, yes. The high point of the lake had climbed their bench until it had been only 100 meters downslope from them. The re-exposed wet ground down there had turned from rusty black to dirty white in less than 20 seconds. Freezing time on Mars. And that is where we left off. Freezing time on Mars. And Kansas Nav, thank you for a tier fucking 3 and 38 months. Sax had stayed in his seat through all that, absorbed by the flickering on his screen. A lot of the water would evaporate, or rather freeze and sublime, he muttered to no one as he worked. It was a heavily carbonated saline brine, but it would end up as dust-filled snow, falling somewhere else. The atmosphere might get hydrated enough so that it would snow several times, or even on a regular basis, in cycles of precipitation and sublimation. Thus, the floodwater would get distributed pretty evenly planet-wide. Take notes. I'm kidding. It's just weather. Okay, thus the floodwater would get distributed pretty evenly planet-wide, except perhaps at the highest altitudes. Albedo. Albedo? What the fuck is albedo? Albedo effect? The albedo effect is the amount of sunlight that a surface reflects back into space. It's a measure of how well a surface reflects light, and it is determined by the surface's color. All right. Thus, the floodwater would get redistributed pretty evenly planet-wide, except perhaps at the highest altitudes. Albedo would rise dramatically. So surface-wide heat reflection would rise dramatically. They would have to lower it, presumably, by encouraging the snow algae that the Acheron group had created. But there was no more Acheron, Anne said to him in her mind. Black ice would melt by day and freeze by night, sublimate and precipitate, and thus they would have a waterscape. Streams collecting, pooling, running downstream, freezing and expanding in cracks in the rock, subliming and snowing, and melting and running again. Hey, hey, marry me, algae. Blah, blah, blah. It would I think albedo is important. Albedo would rise dramatically. They would have to lower it, presumably, by encouraging the snow algae the Acheron group had created. But there was no Acheron, Anne said to him in her mind. Black ice would melt by day, then freeze at night, sublimate and precipitate, and thus they would have a waterscape. Streams collecting, pooling, running downstream, freezing and expanding in the cracks in the rock, subliming and snowing, and melting and running again. A glaciated or muddy world, most of the time. But a waterscape nonetheless. And every single feature of primal Mars would melt away. Red Mars was gone. R.I.P. Anne lay there on the floor by the window. Her tears poured out of her to join the flood. Over the dam of her nose, downstream, until her right cheek and ear and the whole side of her face was wet. This will complicate the process of getting down canyon, Michelle said with a little Gaelic smile. Gaelic? I don't think it's Gaelic. I think it's Gallic. I don't know what that means either, though. Garlic smile. I'm gonna use that. Never mind. This will complicate the process of getting down canyon, Michelle said with a little garlic smile. And from the next car, Frank laughed. In fact, it looked as if it would be impossible for them to proceed even 5 kilometers. Directly before them, the canyon highway was buried under the great landslide, completely gone. The new spill of rock was shattered and unstable, sapped from below by the flood, pounded from above by the subsequent mass. From the subsequent mass wasting of the new slope. For a long time, the others debated even making a try. They had to speak loudly to be heard over the jet engine roar of the flood, which still swept past with no sign of a let-up. Nadia considered the slope suicidal. But Michelle and Casey were pretty sure they could find a way. And after a long day's reconnaissance on foot, they managed to convince Nadia to try it. And the rest were willing if Nadia was. And so the day after that, protected from surveillance by the general dust storm and the flood stream, they divided into the 2 cars and drove slowly out into the slide. It was a rough mass of gravel and sand, liberally sprinkled with boulders. There was, however, a zone corresponding to the bench below it, which was relatively level. This zone was the only thing that made passage possible. It was a matter of finding an unobstructed way over a surface like poorly mixed cement, around boulders, and past the occasional gaping hole. Bro didn't know I'd be reading this live on Twitch. Okay. Nobody could have predicted this. Michelle drove the lead car boldly, with stubbornness verging on reckless. Desperate measures, he declared cheerily. Can you imagine getting on this kind of ground in the normal course of things? It would be insane. It's insane now, Nadia said sourly. Well, what can we do? We can't go back, and we can't give up. These are the times that try men's souls. Women, however, do fine. I was quoting. You know what I mean. There is simply no possibility of going back. The head of Eos will be flooded wall to wall. I suppose it's this that makes me somehow happy. Have we ever been so free of choices? The past is wiped out. All that matters is now. The present and the future. The present and the future. And the future is this field of stones. And here we are. And you know, you never really summon all of your strength until you know that there's no way back. No way to go but onward. And so onward they went. But Michelle's sanguinity was sharply reduced when the second car collapsed into a hole that had been concealed by some kind of trapdoor arrangement of boulders. With some work, they were able to open the front lock and pull out Cassie, Maya, Frank, and Nadia. But there was no chance whatsoever of freeing the second car. They didn't have the lift or the leverage. So they transferred all the supplies out of it until the lead car was absolutely stuffed. And they moved on. 8 of them and their supplies, all now in a single car, for like 5,000 more kilometers minimum. And they moved on. 8 of them and their supplies, all now in a single car. Beyond the landslide, however, it got easier. They followed the canyon highway down into Melis Chasma and found that the road had been built close to the south wall. And as Melis was such a broad canyon, the flood had had room to spread out and had bowed off some ways to the north. It still sounded like air miners were running at full capacity right outside their lock, but the road was well above and to the south of the flood, which was releasing veils of frost steam that filled the chasm and obscured any views further north. Yeah, graboids. Unironically, one of my favorite movies. Excuse me. And obscured their views farther north. So they proceeded without difficulty for a couple of nights, until they came to the Geneva Spur, which stuck out from the gigantic south wall nearly to the edge of the flood. Here, the official road had swung out into what was now the course of the deluge, and they had to find a higher route. The rocky traverses they made around the lower slopes of the spur were really difficult for the rover. Once they were nearly hung up on an obtruding rounded rock, and Maya shouted at Michelle, accusing him of recklessness. She took over the driving, while Michelle and Casey and Nadia went out in walkers. They jacked them off. I dropped the book. I can't. It's okay. This book is only like 100 years old. It's fine. I dropped it. It's only like 4 feet. I don't even... Okay, luckily I remember a page number. When I heard that, the popcorn I was eating fell out of my mouth. I swear that's what it said. I'm gonna drop the book again. They jacked them. Can I change the wording? Freezing. Are we not doing phrasing anymore? I literally can't read this. They jacked them off the rock. They lifted them off the rock and then walked ahead to reconnoiter the route of the oh my god. Now I actually don't know even what I'm reading. Now it's too smart for me. Are you jacking on in there? Once they were nearly hung up on an obtruding rounded rock. What did they use to lift it? Their penises. Their boners. Over a protruding rounded rock. I can't. And Maya shouted at Michel, accusing him of recklessness. She took over the driving while Michel and Casey and Nadia went out in walkers. They lifted them off the rock and then walked ahead to reconnoiter the route of the traverse. I understand it, but I don't know how to read it out loud. To reconnoiter the route of the traverse. Period. Frank and Simon helped Maya look for obstructions as she drove. Good to see you, Quib. Helped Maya look for obstructions as she drove. Sax continued to spend all his time at his screen. From time to time, Frank would turn on the TV and run a search for signals, trying to piece together news from the occasional staticky voices the radio found in the jamming. On the very spine of the Geneva Spur, as they were crossing the absurdly thin concrete thread of the Trans-Canyon Highway, they were far enough out from the south wall to get transmissions. Some transmissions. There was something about it not becoming a global dust storm after all. And indeed, the days were sometimes only hazy, rather than clotted with the dust. Sachs claimed this as proof of the relative success of the dust-fixing strategies pursued after the Great Storm. No one responded to this. The haze that was in the air, Frank observed, seemed actually to help clarify weak radio signals. That was stochastic resonance, Sachs said. The phenomenon was counterintuitive, and Frank questioned Sachs closely for an explanation of it. When he understood, the room rang with his mirthless bray. Maybe all the emigration was stochastic resonance, enhancing the weak signal of the revolution. I don't think it helps to make analogies between the physical and social worlds, Sachs said primly. Shut up, Sachs. Go back to your virtual reality. Frank was still angry, still filled with bitter bile. It sublimed from him like the frost steam of the flood. He snapped questions at Michel about the hidden colony, his curiosity bursting out 2 or 3 times a day. Anne was happy to think She would not be Hiroko when Frank first met her. Michelle answered these Michelle answered these accusing questions calmly, ignoring the sarcasm and furious gleam in Frank's eye. Maya's attempts to cool Frank only increased his rage, but she kept at it. Anne was impressed how persistent she was, how insensitive to Frank's brisk rejections. It was a side of Maya that Anne had never seen before. Maya was usually the most volatile person around. But not now, when the pressure was really on. Eventually they rounded the Geneva Spur and got back on the bench under the southern escarpment. The way east was often interrupted by landslides, but they always had room to veer left around them. Progress was good. But then they came to the eastern end of Melis. Here, the greatest chasm of them all narrowed and dropped several hundred meters down into the two parallel canyons of Coppertese, which were separated by a long, narrow plateau. South Coppertese dead-ended in a cliffy head wall, some 250 kilometers away. North Coppertese connected with the lower canyons farther east, and therefore was the one they wanted to take. North Coppertese was the longest single segment of the Marineris system. Michelle called it La Manche, and it, like the English Channel, narrowed as it progressed eastward, until at around 60 degrees longitude, it narrowed and reared into a gigantic gorge. Sheer cliffs 4 kilometers high, facing each other across a gap only 20 kilometers across. Michelle called this gorge Dover Gate. Apparently, the cliff walls in this gap were whitish, or had been. All right, I gotta pee really bad. And we'll get back to the white walls of Dover when I return.